She manages the house, Nathan said, laughing a little, the way people laugh when they're saying something they think is obvious. That's what she does. The table went quiet for a second. Not long enough for anyone to say something, but long enough for Sylvia to hear it. She set her fork down very carefully. She didn't look at him. She looked at the candle in the middle of the table, and she thought, he actually believes that. That was the part that stayed with her. Later, when the guests had gone and the kitchen was clean, and Nathan had poured himself another scotch and was watching the game in the living room like the evening had gone perfectly well. He actually believed it. Not just in front of the others. He believed it when no one was watching too. 17 years, and somehow he had arrived at a version of their life in which she was background furniture. Something that kept the household running so he could concentrate on the real work. She lay awake that night listening to him breathe. He fell asleep in 4 minutes, she counted. They had met in Ottawa in the winter of 2006, at a conference for mid-level public policy consultants who had too many opinions and not enough power. Sylvia Marchetti had just turned 29. Nathan Calloway was 32, and had the kind of confidence that reads as competence, until you know someone well enough to tell the difference. She had thought at the time that she was falling for a man who was going somewhere. She hadn't been wrong about that. She'd just misunderstood who was doing the driving. When they got married 18 months later, she was managing communications for a provincial regulatory body, and had 2 years left on a contract that would have moved her into a senior director role by 35. She was good at it. Her colleagues knew it. Her supervisor, a sharp woman named Dr. Anita Kowalczyk, had told her plainly, "You're the kind of person organizations build around." Nathan's consulting firm was smaller then. 3 clients, a leased office in the Glebe, and a reputation that was mostly local. He had the contacts and the charm. He did not have the systems. It started small. Sylvia had a gift for structure, for seeing what was inefficient, what was redundant, where the real problem was hiding underneath the stated one. She'd sit at the kitchen table on weekends with Nathan's client files and find things his team had missed. Pricing misalignments, communication gaps that were costing contracts, proposals that were technically sound but emotionally tone-deaf. She wasn't doing it to be helpful. She was doing it because she couldn't look at a broken system and leave it broken. It was a reflex almost, a tick. Nathan would take her notes to the office on Monday and present the solutions as the result of weekend brainstorming. His clients thought he was unusually thorough. His reputation grew. By 2012, she had quietly let her own contract lapse. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no argument, no moment of sacrifice. Nathan's firm had landed 2 national clients and couldn't keep up with the operational demand. He needed someone to manage intake, client relationships, proposal development. He didn't ask Sylvia directly. He just started forwarding her emails that needed answering, and she answered them, and neither of them said out loud what was happening. She told herself it was temporary. By 2016, Calloway Consulting had 11 full-time staff, offices in Ottawa and Toronto, and a client list that included 3 crown corporations and a major national retailer. Nathan was profiled in a business magazine. The photograph showed him at his desk, looking purposeful. The article quoted him talking about his vision, his methodology, his instinct for client relationships. Sylvia had written the methodology. She had built the client relationship framework. She had written the onboarding documentation that their new hires used. She had negotiated, quietly, from her home office, the retained contract with the Crown Corporation that had tripled their revenue in 18 months. She was listed on the company website as Director of Internal Operations. Nathan called her the backbone of the place at the company Christmas party that year. Once, in passing, before pivoting to talk about the new Toronto office and the expansion plan he'd spent the autumn developing. She had developed it. He had signed off on it. She drank her champagne and smiled at the appropriate moments and drove home afterward while Nathan dozed in the passenger seat, and she thought, he means it as a compliment. That's the thing. He genuinely thinks backbone is enough. The dinner party where it happened, the one that broke something, was at their house in Westboro in early March. Nathan's university friend Ray had come up from Toronto with his new wife, a cardiovascular surgeon named Bridget, who had a precise, quiet way of assessing situations that Sylvia found immediately reassuring. Ray worked in private equity. He'd made a lot of money and was comfortable discussing it. There were 2 other couples, Doug and Patricia, who Nathan golfed with, and Sylvia's university friend Claire, who had come alone because her partner was traveling. The food was Sylvia's, all of it. She'd spent the better part of 2 days on it. A Quebec-style tourtière with house-pickled vegetables, a roasted beet salad, a chocolate tart with salted caramel that had taken 3 attempts to get right. She hadn't been asked if she minded cooking. It had been assumed. The conversation had been going well. Ray was talking about a real estate development he was involved in, something in Mississauga, and Nathan was talking about a new government contract his firm was pursuing, describing it the way he always described things, With momentum, with confidence, with the easy fluency of a man who never questioned whether the room was interested. Bridget had asked, at some point, how Nathan's team managed the transition from proposal to delivery. She had worked with consultants before and always found the handoff chaotic. Nathan had laughed. "We've got a strong team, and Sylvia manages the house, so I don't have to think about anything else." He had gestured vaguely in her direction. "That's what she does." The house was a word that covered 17 years of invisible infrastructure. Bridget looked at Sylvia, not with pity, with something more careful than that. Recognition, maybe. Sylvia looked at the candle, she thought. If I said right now what I actually do, this table would go very quiet, she thought. He has no idea. And then underneath that, the thought that was harder to sit with. I let this happen, I never corrected it. I made it possible for him to not know. She smiled and passed the salad. But something had shifted. A small internal mechanism, like a latch that had been under pressure for years and had finally quietly clicked open. She didn't do anything dramatic, that was never her style. She started that week by simply stopping. Not everything, not all at once. She stopped forwarding meeting notes. She stopped preemptively resolving the small operational problems that came across her desk before they became Nathan's problem. She stopped reaching out to the Crown Corporation contact, a man named Jeffrey who had been calling her mobile directly for 3 years because, as he'd once told her without embarrassment, "Nathan's team doesn't quite get what we need, but you always do." She redirected Jeffrey's calls to Nathan's assistant, a competent but junior woman named Priya, who had never been briefed on the nuances of the file. She stopped reviewing the quarterly proposals before they went out. She stopped. Nathan didn't notice immediately. That was the thing about systems. When they work, no one thinks about them. It's only in the failing that the architecture becomes visible. The first sign came 11 days later. Jeffrey emailed Nathan directly, something he had not done in over 2 years, with a list of concerns about the deliverables timeline. The email was polite but pointed. Nathan forwarded it to Sylvia with a note. "Can you look at this? Not sure what Jeffrey is on about." She wrote back, "I've stepped back from that file. Priya should have the background." He called her 20 minutes later. "What do you mean, step back?" "I've been thinking," she said in the same even tone she used in client calls, "that I should focus on some things I've been putting off. Personal projects." A pause. "What personal projects? I'm going back to school," she said. She had enrolled 3 weeks earlier quietly in an executive leadership program at the University of Ottawa. She had not mentioned it. "Part-time. I'm also doing some consulting work independently." He stopped. "With who?" "I have a few clients, it's early, but it's going well." This was true. She had reached out in January to 4 people she had helped over the years, quietly, in the background, without credit, and told them plainly that she was available independently. 3 had responded within 48 hours. The 4th had called. The calls Nathan made in the following 3 weeks told her a great deal about what she'd built. Doug, whose accounting firm she had quietly helped reorganize 2 years ago, during a dinner conversation that Nathan had described as Sylvia getting into the weeds, called her to ask if she'd be interested in a formal advisory role. Bridget, the surgeon from the dinner party, emailed, having gotten her address from Claire, to say she had a colleague who was setting up a private clinic and needed operational help. Could she recommend anyone? Or, if she was available herself? She replied to Bridget first. Nathan came home on a Thursday evening in April to find her at the kitchen table with her laptop and a notepad covered in her handwriting, the same table where she had spent years reconstructing his proposals, his pitches, his systems. "We need to talk," he said, and sat down across from her. She closed the laptop. She waited. "Jeffrey is going to walk," he said. "The timeline on the Crown contract is a mess. Priya doesn't know the file. I need you to." "Nathan." Her voice was not unkind, it was simply clear. "I spent 3 years managing that relationship. Jeffrey knows me, not the firm. That's not your fault, but it's the situation." He looked at her. He had the expression he sometimes got when a room wasn't going the way he expected. A slight tightening around the eyes, a recalibration. "So what do you want me to do?" "I want you to manage it," she said. "It's your firm." "Sylvia, it's your firm," she said again gently, "and it's a good firm. But some of the things holding it together have been mine, and I wasn't doing it strategically. I was just doing it because I could, because it needed doing." She paused. "I should have had this conversation with you years ago. I didn't. That's on me too." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you leaving?" She looked at him across the table, the same table. 17 years. "No," she said. "But I'm done being invisible." What happened next was not a dramatic confrontation. It was slower than that, and more uncomfortable, and probably more real. Nathan lost the Crown contract, not immediately. Jeffrey held on for another month, hoping the service would stabilize. But by May it was gone. It cost the firm significantly. Nathan spent 2 weeks in damage control mode, and somewhere in those 2 weeks, surrounded by the evidence of a gap he hadn't known existed, he started to understand the shape of what he hadn't seen. He didn't apologize in one conversation. That would have been neater. What he did was start paying attention in a way he hadn't before. Asking questions instead of forwarding emails, listening to the answers, coming home and sitting at the table and saying, "Sometimes. I didn't know you did that. I actually didn't know." One evening in June he said quietly over dinner, "I told Ray and Doug that I'd been running the firm on the assumption that I was doing most of it. And I hadn't been. I think I actually told Ray that last year." "You did," Sylvia said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell, not because he seemed emotional but because he didn't. He was just sitting there with the fact of it. "I know," she said. She had started her own advisory work seriously by then. 3 clients, a small incorporated structure, a growing reputation in operational design that was hers. Documented, credited Dr. Kowalczyk, her old supervisor who had kept in loose touch over the years, had connected her to a network of senior women in public sector consulting, and Sylvia had spent March and April quietly rebuilding a professional identity that had been in a kind of suspended animation for over a decade. She was not starting over. She was returning to something she had never fully left, only set aside in the unexamined way you set aside things you think you'll come back to later. She was 44. By the fall, Nathan had restructured the firm. He hired a senior operations manager, someone with actual credentials and a salary to match, and acknowledged, at least internally, what the role had been doing. He gave Priya a clearer brief and a better title. He brought in a consultant to audit the client relationship framework and was told, by a woman who didn't know the history, that whoever had originally designed it had done exceptional work. He told Sylvia that evening. She smiled into her coffee. "She's right," he said. "It was exceptional. It was what the firm needed at the time," Sylvia said. "I was good at it. I still am, just elsewhere now. Do you miss it?" She thought about that honestly. "I miss the work," she said. "I don't miss being the one who did it without anyone knowing." He nodded. He didn't argue with that. People sometimes ask, when Sylvia tells a version of this story, at events or over dinner with people who are close enough, whether she regrets how long it took, whether she wishes she had said something sooner, set limits sooner, redirected sooner. She thinks about it the way she thinks about most complicated questions. By looking at the actual architecture, not the feeling of it. The system worked for a long time because she was good at systems. She built something functional and clean and she allowed it to become invisible, and the invisibility protected a kind of peace she had valued. That's true, she can't tell a cleaner version of it. But she also knows this. The night of the dinner party, when Nathan made that comment and the table went quiet, and Bridget looked at her with something like recognition. That wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was just the first time she let herself see it clearly. Sometimes it takes a witness. Sometimes you have to see yourself through someone else's careful eyes before you understand what you've been accepting. She and Nathan still live in the house in Westboro. They are not the same people who moved into it. She doesn't think that's a bad thing. She thinks it's the more honest version of what they were always trying to be. 2 people who had built something together, finally talking about who had done what, and what it had cost, and what it was worth. She has a meeting in the morning with a new client, a healthcare organization in Ottawa that is struggling with internal communication and doesn't know yet that the problem is actually structural. She knows what the problem is. She knew it from the first email. She goes to sleep before Nathan does. He's still awake when she turns off her lamp. He's reading something, a file, making notes in the margin the way he's started doing since the spring. More slowly, more carefully, more like someone who's learned that the details matter. She can hear him turning the pages. It's a small sound, but it's a different room than it was in March. Same house, different room, that was the point.